with an introduction of our task force members. And let's begin with David.
Good morning, David Reed, Department of Child Services.
And you have to press your button when you speak. Okay, Senator
Benita
Becker.
Becker, State Senator from Evansville.
Ed Clear, State Representative from New Albany.
Jason Meyer, President of Passages in Columbia City.
Sean Fulton, President of Self-Advocates of Indiana.
Steve Cook, President of NRF, the Provider Association.
Andy Kirby, Associate Executive Director at the ARC of Indiana.
Steve Council, Medical Director representing the Division of Aging, Indiana Family Social Services Administration.
Anam Abdi, Office of Medicaid Policy and Planning.
Julie Reynolds with the Division of Disability and Rehabilitative Services.
And Kylie Hope, the Director of the Division of Disability and Rehabilitative Services.
Hi, Carrie Hamilton, State Representative, House District 87.
Eric.
Eric Heater, Interim Deputy Director of Adult Services with the Division of Mental Health and Addiction.
Yes.
Good morning. I'm Nancy Hosapple. I am the Director of the Office of Special Ed at the Indiana Department of Education.
And Danielle?
Danielle Mice.
Wonderful. If we will turn our attention to the agenda, and our first item on our agenda is review of charge of House Enrolled Act 1488, Laura Brown, who is Special Counsel at the Office of Lieutenant Governor. And when we do speak, be sure and turn on your microphone. Laura?
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. Good morning, everyone. As Lieutenant Governor mentioned, we wanted to begin today's task force meeting, a continuation of the 1102 Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities Task Force, with a review of the charge of House Enrolled Act 1488, as that bill reauthorized this task force and set out specific requirements for this group moving forward. Specifically, under the bill, this task force is required to meet at least twice a year to receive an update from FSSA regarding the implementation of the 1102 final report. One meeting must occur prior to June 15th of each year, at which FSSA will provide a report to the task force outlining each recommendation of the 1102 final report and describing the progress made toward each recommendation, which is what we will accomplish here today. Then the second meeting must occur prior to November 20th of each year, at which FSSA will provide a report to the task force describing any legislative changes that are needed to implement recommendations from the 1102 final report, so that legislative proposals may be drafted prior to the session. The Lieutenant Governor may also call additional meetings of the task force as needed, and these meetings will occur through the end of 2025 when the current enabling legislation expires. In summary, then, we really want to thank everyone who was involved in the 1102 task force, both the task members, the staff, the families, the stakeholders, organizations that came forth to provide public comment and develop the recommendations that we're working off here today. Moving forward, then, the role of this task force will be, one, to partner with FSSA and other stakeholders to gauge the progress on the recommendations, two, collaborate in order to ensure timely and thoughtful implementation of the recommendations, and three, help determine when legislative action is needed to implement the recommendations. If anyone has any questions regarding the task force or future meetings, please do not hesitate to contact me at any time. But I think we will dive right now into the purpose of today's meeting and turn it over to Director of DDRS, Kylie Hope.
Yes, Kylie.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. I hope everyone had a good session. I know we did, and some time off, and excited to be back today to talk about this very important issue related to the report on intellectual and developmental disabilities and the areas of improvement that we can make in the state of Indiana with respect to all of these recommendations. I love actually that in 2019 that there is attention to this population, to this group. There are critical and important issues that we as Hoosiers need to do to improve the lives of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We have an opportunity to truly improve the lives of these individuals, of sometimes some of the most vulnerable population that we have as Hoosiers today. As a government official, as an advocate, and as a sister of a brother that has autism, it is critical that we move forward. And so I appreciate the continuation of 1102. I continue to appreciate the partnership and collaboration, the spirit of Hoosiers that we have to really make that improvement. And so I'm going to go through today all of the recommendations and provide you an update on where we are. However, I really cannot take full credit on any of these. I have many of you at the General Assembly, many of the key legislators today, the DDRS staff, NARF, the ARC, the Indiana Disability Rights, Governor's Council of People with Disabilities. All of those key important entities have made significant changes even in this last legislative session to see it make movement and to keep this momentum going. It is truly important also as we continue to work at a state level that we work at a local level to really ensure that our state and local communities continue to be more inclusive of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and that self-advocates can truly just live the life that they want to live. Sometimes, unfortunately, the designs that we have in systems or the way and barriers that they've had have made barriers for them to really do what they want to do. And so this is an opportunity, again, to pave that road for them. So today, again, as I stated, I plan to provide an update to the great work that we have done. Again, thanks to many of you. And to be very frank, we have heard some great stories from families and self-advocates. And while they don't have to understand the system, they don't have to tell me what specific little button would be helpful to change or what service definition needs tweaked, it is critical that those families and self-advocates continue to tell us their stories, allow us to hear kind of their struggles, some of their barriers, their desires, their wants, what would be helpful. Because in some ways we have an upcoming blank slate that we have some opportunity to really change the way in which we serve individuals and support individuals to live the life they want. I also want to I don't want to come away without thanking Dr. Walthall, who is our Secretary of Family Social Services Administration. Her leadership in this area has been phenomenal, and I think has allowed us, again, to continuously move and push this momentum with the desires of families and self-advocates, as well as the recommendations of the task force. So in front of you, you have a long legal-size paper that I do apologize for the size of the font, and I will send this electronically so that you all will have this available in that manner as well. But as far as this chart goes, trying to figure out how to display this, and actually I appreciate the ARC of Indiana did some legwork on really getting this up and started. So on the left side, you have the recommendation that corresponds specifically with the 1102 task force recommendation. That second column is the actual recommendation language. The third column outlines, if you will, the responsible party. These are all can be subject to change based on feedback you guys all have as well. The next column is talking about the related DDRS initiative with respect to kind of our strategic plan that we've had and how do we fold some of these recommendations into our strategic plan. And then really looking at, is this recommendation a legislative, an other, or a policy, to kind of put it in some categories. I know the next part on the agenda will have some more open discussion on some of the legislative potential needs. And then this column is on the status. It gives you a snapshot, if you will, on where we are, what are some of the activities that have gone on to really help match the recommendation moving forward. And then I did leave a legislative needs column for any type of notes that you may have or ability to go back and provide this information at a later date. Then throughout, at the top, you can see there is a green line that demonstrates that these recommendations underneath that is complete or nearly complete. Then you have a yellow line that indicates that these are initiatives or items that have been launched or are continuously ongoing. And then as you see, if you flip to the second to last page, there is a red line that demonstrates that these are items that will continue to need some action related to them. So, any questions before I get started? Good? All right. And I'm happy to take questions throughout. I'm happy to wait at the end, so please, I know it seems very formal, but I know it's still a task force, so please allow open dialogue. I'm happy with that to engage that way. So recommendation 1.4 is really related to convening a group of diverse stakeholders with the waiver redesign. And let me just remind everyone, so what's waiver redesign? So the home and community-based settings has an ability to utilize Medicaid funding to develop waivers that allows us to create, the state to create, home and community-based services and supports. It's a menu of options to really utilize for individuals that meet our level of care to utilize those services in the community how they want to live in their home, where do they want to live in their community. And so we have an ability here, we haven't really adjusted those waivers in roughly 25 years. So we're looking at a time now to say, hey, it's 2019, what makes the most sense for serving the individuals that we have that are participating on the waiver, but also may in the future participate on our waiver. So we have completed that 1.4 recommendation. We are utilizing our Division of Disability and Rehabilitative Service Advisory Council as the primary stakeholder group to assist with this waiver redesign. That is not the only work group, because there will be several work groups related to many of the items of waiver redesign, but the work group and the key stakeholder group will be the DDRS Advisory Council.
Kylie, can you tell us who's on that advisory
Yes, so
council?
there are representatives. Many of them are in this room. So NARP is a representative. The ARC of Indiana is a representative. The Department of Education is a representative. Self-advocates and families, we have representatives from the Division of Disability and the various bureaus. We have, I'm sorry, I wish I had my list. It's hard to come off. Julie, can you name a few others? We have First Steps representation and provider representation.
Yeah. Case managers.
Thank you. Case management representation on that group.
Governor's Council as well.
In Governor's Council. So the ability is to really look at those representatives are representing, again, a constituent basis that is key to this waiver redesign. And then those individuals will also be assisting us in providing from the other work groups to provide recommendations to that DDRS Advisory Council to really do what it's intended to advise the division on kind of next steps and agreement on how to move forward. And I am happy to also provide an actual list of that council advisory group to you as well for the task force to review. 3.1 is regarding early childhood development and early intervention services, or in Indiana we call that First Steps. It's really identifying that the First Steps program to really increase and to provide more effective programming due to our increased referrals for early intervention. How can we get enhanced funding in order to really sustain that high quality program for children and families that it serves? Again, I don't like to presume that everyone knows all of this, so early intervention serves individuals with a developmental disability or potential high risk for having a developmental disability from 0 to 3. And thanks to many of those here today, specifically Representative Claire, and allowing us, First Steps did receive $18 million each year of the biennium, which included a new approximately $6.6 million in new funding for the program. And so this allows us to then look at one of the key concerns for the First Steps program were our provider rates and ensuring that we can maintain and retain providers, recruit and retain providers to do the valuable critical services of early intervention. As many of you guys know, great early intervention services provides a return on investment with respect to a long-term plan for those individuals from as they enter school and also as they exit school. So with the utilization of that additional funding, there was a breakdown of 50% will be utilized for provider rates increases. 40% of that new $6.6 million will be utilized to improve the contract needs of the single point of entry, which are the entities in our state that are really kind of the front door to that system. So those individuals and staff are required to do child find, to identify and evaluate the individuals and develop the plan for the families and infants and children, and then identify what service providers to provide those services. And then lastly, there is the 10% use of that money that the program can use for infrastructure needs. Any questions? So those are the two items that are complete or nearly complete. So if we can go down to looking at what is ongoing, and many of these, to be fair, will be ongoing for some time. So let's start with 1.1. Identifying that the division will develop a Medicaid HCBS waiver system with a full array of services and tiered supports to ensure flexibility of services and systems that meet the unique needs of individuals served, accounting for age, family, community supports, behavioral and mental health needs, and health factors. I will indicate that this primarily 1.1 is wrapped up in the waiver redesign process. So in the Division of Disability and Rehabilitative Services has contracted with HSRI to help us with the waiver redesign process, and we launched and did a kickoff meeting in April of 2019. So that is very exciting. We are looking at having about a 30-month work plan to develop and secure CMS approval on the new waivers. I will say at the April meeting, what was most exciting for me, and many of you are here from the task force and out in the audience, that we had approximately 85 individuals show up for that public meeting. I think it's a record, right, Steve? Maybe a record. I don't know, maybe closing the institutions, you had a few more. But so I felt that was a great testament to the work that this task force has done, and the work, to be very fair, that the Bureau of Developmental Disability Services has done to really kind of energize individuals to get there. Some may have been there because they're thinking, what are we doing? What are they doing, right? Others may be there because they truly were excited. We don't care. We want people involved. We want people to be there, to be educated, to be informed, to share their stories again, and to truly work as a collaborative and partnership for all of our industry to really make the changes that need to work. So that one is ongoing, but if you will, completed, meaning we have a great national contractor with some great subcontractors, and we have groups aligned, and it has been kicked off.
Kylie, if I can add, just for those who don't know, in reaching out and contracting with people to do this work, there is a request for proposal that was issued and scored through a procurement process. And HSRI, it stands for the Human Services Research Institute.
Thank you. 1.3, and I will try to avoid just reading for you guys the recommendation, you all can read, but is really looking at modifying current legislation to talk about the priority categories. Modifying current legislation dictating waiver placement priority to current Medicaid HCBS waivers. So looking then as their status, HEA 1488 requires FSSA to work in partnership with 1102 Task Force to develop new priority categories by July 1 of 2021. I think we've had some small internal conversation and external conversation about priorities, but we also anticipate that these priority categories will be part of the overall waiver redesign. For some of you that may or may not understand what priorities are, so it's identifying through a 1915C, there's an ability to say, outline what are the priority categories that an individual meets to get on one of the waiver needs. There's emergency priority categories currently on the community integration habilitation waiver, and a few priority categories, one which we'll talk about in a little bit, the military ability to in some way get immediate assistance and ability to access the waiver. So again, as a system redesign, really looking at what are those priorities, and we'll have some key conversations also beyond to understand what are the priorities of individuals and families as well as our key stakeholders. Dr. Council.
Remind me which waiver we're talking about. What's the name of that?
So there are two IDD waivers. There's a family support waiver, and then there's the community integration habilitation waiver.
Kylie, can you also, for our reference going forward as we look at new priority categories, how often does the emergency category, is it utilized currently, and some examples of people that might get that priority?
Sure. So there are several priority categories for CIH waiver. So there's a caregiver that is over 80. So if a caregiver is over 80, that individual can get the waiver as a priority. There's an abuse and neglect priority. There is the ability to, I'm going to forget, a
caregiver, a primary caregiver who passes away.
Thank you. And then there's a health and safety. So sometimes with respect to health and safety, there is a desire or a need to collect information to really understand what is that emergent need of that individual. We've had issues related to homelessness. We've had issues related to sometimes individuals' parents are significantly ailing due to a terminal illness and that type of thing, but they're not 80 and they haven't died. But without really having a CIH waiver, that is another example of areas that health and safety may kick in as a priority category.
Kylie, if I can add to that, we also have priority categories on there for people that would like to come out of an institution, so out of a supported group living institution or a state-operated facility. We also have some priority categories on there for individuals that might be receiving services through a different funding stream that they are state line. So there's several other ones. They're kind of those non-emergencies, but primarily folks that would like to leave an institution and live more in the community.
So in the course of a year, would you give out 1,000 of those or 50 of those? What's the kind of volume of that?
To be fair, Steve, I'd have to go look at the data. I don't know that I have that off the top of my head. I wouldn't want to misquote, but I can look that and provide that to the task force. We'll be preparing that for the DDRS Advisory Council, so that will be, which is next week. So 1.6 talks about Indiana create an economy workforce where youth and adults with disabilities, including individuals with significant disabilities, have real opportunities to become competitively employed. Really talking about supports and efforts with the Indiana Rehabilitation Commission, which is the commission that oversees or is an advisory, if you will, with the vocational rehabilitation program, and to implement employment first in Indiana, which encourages their efforts to develop policies and practices and service delivery to facilitate competitive and integrated employment, which really means that really looking at making competitive integrated employment the first and preferred outcome for individuals with disabilities. So this one has several responsible parties, if you will, and I will, again, this is a key area that when I talk about the state of Indiana and policies, I'm also talking about the local communities and businesses and vocational rehabilitation and other workforce programs to really hit home and make sure that we are acknowledging and reinforcing the workforce of individuals with disabilities, specifically youth and adults, to ensure that they have the opportunity to receive competitive and integrated employment and really make that an expectation. So if you look at the status, we do have an Employment First Advisory Committee. It continues to meet on a regular basis. I'm sorry, Senator Becker? Yeah. Very familiar. Yeah, I think there is some work that I think we could definitely discuss. I don't know if Steve wants to talk any on the Ability One side of things.
Well, it's actually Ability Indiana, not Ability One, and it was actually NDOT that put out the RFP, not BMV. But there are 85 individuals with disabilities making a competitive wage. I think the average is between $9 and $10 an hour, and so we've had those contracts for 30 years. And we're surprised that all of a sudden they're going to do the fair market analysis through a competitive bid process. We think Ability Indiana is entitled to that work under current law. So we are trying to work with NDOT and everyone else to keep those jobs. Again, they're good paying jobs for individuals, 85 people with disabilities. So we are following up on it.
And just to kind of piggyback on Senator Becker's remarks, we in our office, Lieutenant Governor's office, has been in contact with NDOT and been working with them. I couldn't agree with you more when we talk about providing employment for people with disabilities when the state has that opportunity to do that, and then we don't do it. I think that is very disturbing. So I agree and be happy to work with you and Representative Claire and Representative Hamilton to ensure that we continue to make that a priority.
Appreciate the Lieutenant Governor's support as well as NRF's work on this as well, because I know I had forwarded on to people as well as sending a letter to the Governor's office. But I think this is critical when we're talking about people with disabilities. We ought to be doing more as a state, not less.
Yeah.
So,
absolutely. No, thank you for your attention to that. I also want to point out Christine Dahlberg and the great work of the Governor's Council. They recently have funded a series of Employment First town halls that is gathering great insight and some potential solutions for improving employment for people with disabilities. Some of you may have seen the new brand of Work to Include. I think they have done a really great grassroots efforts, if you will, to take those town hall meetings all around the state and truly talk about employment needs, barriers, success stories. And I appreciated their formatting and how they're doing that. I also know that they had recently Emily Munson on Inside Indiana Business talking at great length about the importance of employment and the unemployment for individuals with disabilities. I would go even as far to say sometimes the underemployment for individuals with disabilities, really making sure that there's pathways and opportunities for them. So I don't know, Christine, is there anything you want to add since this is...
I could add that those town halls took place in 11 different communities around last one that happened Tuesday evening. We had them in the evening when families and people could get there, people that worked. We didn't assume that people could come during the middle of the day. The Clarksville one, I think, was about 35 people, which is pretty good for I'd say the average was, I think our top one was like 75 and our smallest one was 22 or something. But all in all, about 400 people attended those town hall meetings, and it was primarily adults with disabilities and family members. There were providers and there were community members, like the mayor from Richmond came, and several of the other mayors came. The mayor-elect from Gary actually attended the entire town hall meeting. So it really is generating a lot of excitement, and it's a project that we're very pleased to have funded and very proud of.
Christine, could you introduce yourself and your position for those that are watching?
Sure. I'm Christine Dahlberg. I'm the Executive Director of the Governor's Council for People with Disabilities, which is a really teeny-weeny state agency. There's only 5 of us.
But mighty.
Also, through the work to include, there's efforts underway to really develop and propose an executive order declaring the state, Indiana, as a model employer. In addition, with vocational rehabilitation in particular, we have utilized the pre-employment transition service funding, which is funding that is a set-aside or earmarked funding to really just support students that are already still in school, to really help them with their pathways of career exploration and getting them exposure to some of the skills that they may need, or just attempt to seek what their interests are so that when they graduate they have a pathway moving forward into employment. Recently we have worked with the Department of Workforce Development to identify an MOU to utilize the pre-ETS funding to really enhance an evidence-based practice that many of you guys are already aware of as Jobs for American Graduates. In Indiana, that's an awesome program, nationally recognized. We really appreciated the DWD's partnership in that, because we feel that while there are some needs for specialized services in the workforce for individuals with disabilities, sometimes individuals or students with disabilities need access to some of the great already existing career and vocational opportunities. So that is one of the areas that I would tout, if you will, of more of a creative collaboration or partnership with another agency to really assist students with disabilities. And we hope to actually do more in the future around Jobs for American Graduates, or JAG program. And then we are also working on developing, hopefully, some more employer and vocational and technical and career and technical education opportunities. Dr. Nancy Holzapfel with the Department of Education has had some great insight and internal conversations. Again, how do we ensure that students with disabilities that are in school have access to maybe some already existing in the school structure of like career and tech opportunities, to make sure they have the supports necessary to do that. So those are some areas, again, related to the recommendation related to students with disabilities and that workforce.
Kylie, this question, I don't know if it's appropriate for this particular recommendation, but sure. Is there any way you can provide a kind of a list of those programs that perhaps we leave federal money on the table because we don't provide the state match? I think that would be very beneficial for the legislators. I know I would be very interested in seeing where we're leaving federal money on the table. Sure. Thank you. Welcome, Senator Melton. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Good morning, everyone. Sorry for being late. Just got off the road. Senator Eddie Melton, Senate District 3, Gary, Maryville, Holbrook, Crown Point, Lake Station, and New Chicago. And looking forward to learning a little bit more about this subject matter. Thank you.
All right, so going to the second page. 1.7, the development and promotion of public and private sector partnerships that support youth acquiring work experience, skills, and access to resources. There's somewhat, if you will, redundancies with respect to some of the stuff I talked about. Having a strong transition partnership should be considered as part of any new Medicaid HCBS waiver redesigns and services offered. So this ties pretty neatly with vocational rehabilitation. We regularly convene a transition advisory committee that involves the Indiana Department of Education, the Department of Workforce Development, and other key stakeholders to identify opportunities to really expand transition opportunities, and to be frank, to learn from each other, so that there doesn't need to be duplication of services, but what are other state agencies and local entities and stakeholders doing to really support students with disabilities, and then how do we kind of band together, partner to make that stronger, and are there opportunities to start braiding funding to also align with what makes sense. Here is the definition of pre-employment transition services for your ability to understand what that all includes. Again, we also, vocational rehabilitation has attempted to improve their infrastructure relating to transition, pre-employment transition services. We are in the process right now of hiring 10 additional transition VR counselors that are really focused on identifying what are those local needs, how can we continue to help educate schools in the local communities and employers on students with disabilities and their needs to be able to expand those opportunities early and being more proactive rather than them exiting high school with without some of that experience and vocational training opportunities. We also continue to really have our efforts through pre-ETS employment activities with business development. Our small but mighty business development team within the Bureau of Rehabilitation Services. We've hosted several student days, if you will, from many key employers in various areas, and partnered with schools to really make sure students with disabilities had an opportunity to experience what are some potential jobs out there as well. And then, of course, with the waiver redesign, we hear all the time that individuals with disabilities, with intellectual and developmental disabilities, whether you're a student or not, want to work. And so as we continue to look at waiver redesign process, some of that purposeful strategy of services supports, how do we ensure that if someone gets a job, what are maybe some additional supports that the HCBS waiver can do to ensure that they can maintain that job? So anything potentially from some technology opportunities to transportation opportunities and just general supported employment that can also be funded from the waiver home and community-based settings rule. So those are some ideas, if you will, that we've heard from families and individuals and done some more national research from what other states have done related to their HCBS waivers and the need for really keeping employment at the forefront of the needs and the wants, desires of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities.
Kylie, will those 10 additional VR counselors be assigned to certain regions?
Yep, they will be assigned to certain regions. We have about 6 in the hiring process right now. And yeah, we will be identifying where those individuals will land with respect to regional offices. We see them more, obviously, we have about 53,000 students that are transition aged in school. So clearly 10 cannot serve 53,000 individuals, but it allows, I think, continue to have a key present with vocational rehabilitation in those regions. It allows them to work with their local workforce development boards, as well as the schools and special education districts, to really make sure that people understand the importance of pre-employment transition services, that we maybe explore if there's some innovation or opportunities in certain regions that they want to move forward. How can we help provide technical assistance, as well as some potential pre-employment transition funding at another opportunity through contracts. 1.8, looking at expanding and promoting housing options, especially permanent support housing for all people with disabilities. Allows for informed choice for them to attain affordable, accessible, and integrated housing and community they choose to live in. As options are being developed, the task force encourages the modernization of housing development projects to reflect current technology and modernization of existing housing resources. I will say that we've had also some great collaboration with the Indiana Housing and Community Development Association. I know Matt Rayburn is here today also to demonstrate some support. So IHCDA specifically has collaborated with DDRS on the community integration set-aside. DDRS has also partnered with IHCDA on the most recent CSH Supportive Housing Summit that was held in Indianapolis. We are also partnering with IHCDA more in the near future on a specific initiative focused on housing and technology for people with IDD. And in addition, into creating these specific housing opportunities, we believe that this effort will create a model that can be replicated by other affordable housing developers. This effort, in addition to IHCDA's effort is to include IDD-specific requirements in their low-income housing tax credit program. So to be fair, thanks to Lieutenant Governor as well as IHCDA, I appreciate that housing partnership greatly. As many of you guys know, individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, housing and transportation are sometimes the top barriers for these individuals. And so I not only appreciate the acknowledgement of that need in identifying this as a vulnerable population that sometimes just having housing will set them on a trajectory that is transformational for them. But I also appreciate the desire to modernize that and to really look at creativity through technology. So I don't know if you or Matt want to say a few words.
Thank you, Kylie. If it's all right with the task force member, housing is the agency, one of the agencies I oversee. And Matt, I hate to put you on the spot, but if you can maybe just share with them, with the set aside, what we currently do for individuals with disabilities, and then the housing project that you all are going to partner with DERS on. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Matt Rayburn. I'm the Deputy Executive Director and Chief Real Estate Development Officer with the Indiana Housing and Community Development Authority. As the Lieutenant Governor said, we are part of her family of business, and we are the state housing finance agency for the state of Indiana. One of the key programs that IHCDA administers is the Low Income Housing Tax Credit Program, which is the primary funding source we have to fund both the new construction as well as the rehabilitation of affordable housing, and that is a statewide program that we administer. Since our 2018 allocation plan, so 2018 and 2019, we've allocated 2 rounds of funds, and in our allocation plan for 2020 and 2021, we have also committed to do this. We have set aside 10% of our low-income housing tax credits each year for developments that meet what we call our community integration set-aside. And the community integration set-aside means for affordable housing developers to apply for that set-aside amount of funds, they have to agree that 25% of the housing units they are created will be designated for occupancy by persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Those units have to be integrated within a larger housing development or scattered throughout the community, so it is not a segregated or group home setting. This is permanent supportive housing for individuals. They'll be leaseholders, they'll have all the rights and responsibilities of a leaseholder, but there'll be on-site supportive services and connections with local nonprofits to provide services to support and maintain that housing. So we have allocated out the 2018 and 2019 funds under that set-aside, and we're able to fund 9 developments that are creating about 100 integrated units. Again, that's 25%, so they're creating a larger number of units, but 25% of those 100 will be specifically for this population. And as I mentioned, we have committed that for our 2020 and 2021 allocation, we will continue that approach as well. So that is the key thing we've been working on. We really back to late 2016, but heavily in 2017, worked with Kylie on developing that program and had great support from DDRS. So with that partnership, as we've worked with DDRS over the last couple of years on thinking through this model, we've decided to also try to take that to the next level and really push the envelope on using this same housing resource and working with both for-profit and nonprofit affordable housing developers. How can we continue to push forward housing that's not only designated for the population, but that pushes the envelope on smart home technology and assistive technologies to make the units even more accessible and usable for persons of all abilities. So while the program, the full details of this special initiative we're going to do, which will be above and beyond the 10% that we've dedicated for the next few years, while those details aren't entirely firmed up, we are actively working with DDRS on designing that program, and we anticipate an RFP going out in either August or September of this year for developers who would like to go through this special program. It'll be a competitive RFP process, and we will be selecting upfront development teams based on their qualifications. They will then be going through an intensive workshop process with IHCDA, with DDRS, and with our partner, the Corporation for Supportive Housing, to really think together and go together as a cohort, thinking about how to utilize these assistive technologies, how to implement kind of a smart home program. And our goal is that we can, through doing this combination of funding resources resources and technical assistance that we can get these developers to create affordable housing that will have the highest level of smart home technology that we have seen in Indiana and that will be extremely accessible. So we're very excited to launch this initiative. By the next task force meeting in September, we should have more details about the specific program that DDRS and IHCDA is meeting here within the next week to continue moving that forward. And as I mentioned, we anticipate the RFP going out in probably late August, early September. But I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Matt. Questions? Yes.
Matt, thank you very much for the overview, and I thank you all for taking a look at this. As it was mentioned, just wanted to make a note too, affordable, accessible housing is a huge challenge, and especially in rural neighborhoods, rural areas. So I'm very happy that you're taking a look at this, and this integrating that smart home technology is key going forward, especially with all the technology out there. I'm glad that's being looked at. Thank you for the overview today too.
Matt, the 9 projects that you described, where are those throughout the state?
Yeah, so I will share with Kylie a list of all those that she can share with you. They are somewhat scattered throughout the state. I would say right now the 9 that have been funded are veering a little more towards larger size communities than the rural. But that'll be something we're specifically looking at through the next program, is making sure that we're getting developments in a variety of community sizes. But there is a decent spread throughout the state for those 9 that we have funded so far. We've put together a memo that we have shared with DDRS and with the Lieutenant Governor's office that identifies where those 9 developments are, how many units at each, and who the partners are, both the developer that's building it as well as the service providers. So I'll make sure that Kylie still has that memo and that it can be shared with the task force.
Thank you, Matt.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Kylie.
I feel like we could just stop there. 1.9. When looking at developing and adopting a shared living model as a residential service option which resembles the most successful shared living programs in the United States, and some states were discussed at the last task force time, was like related to Colorado, Pennsylvania. The current structured family caregiving model used by Indiana doesn't provide the proper reimbursement methodology to provide really the robust supports needed and really displayed to make sure that it's the most successful model. So an update on that particular approach. Since March, DDRS has convened a work group focused on developing recommendations of the shared living model that will be shared, and those recommendations will be put forth in the future waiver redesign project. So as I indicated about, DDRS Advisory Council is kind of overseeing the waiver redesign. Well, here's an example of a work group, an offshoot of other key stakeholders that are working together to really put forth, here's what we feel the shared living model in Indiana needs to look like. Those recommendations will be reviewed, and depending on lots of things, I anticipate I think collectively in 1102 that this was one of those key areas for shared living that we want to expand in Indiana, and we know the success nationally, and we think that it is a very great opportunity for individuals with disabilities as well. I know they met yesterday. Can I pick on Steve? Anything you want to add to that since you were at the meeting?
I was, and I think things are going very well. I mean, this is a model where people with disabilities live with a family that they're not related to. And we've had great discussion on how the matching process is such a key. And we talked about the different roles of the individual, the provider, the family where they live. So I think we're making good progress, and I'm sure it's going to fit in nicely to the waiver redesign.
Great. Thank you. All right, next page. Recommendation 1.10 is really related to institutional modernization of our system. So the recommendation is identifying that there will be a group of stakeholders that include self-advocates and advocacy groups, organizations, agencies, provider organizations, and representative of the 1102 task force to really no later than December 31st of 2020 to convene a group that will develop a plan that addresses these 5 areas. With respect to the status update on that, the Institutional Modernization Workgroup Charter has been drafted, and we plan to send out invitations to the identified participants by the end of this month. So this, again, is another key work group. It has not been started, but we hope to start it, obviously, here this summer and get working on this, another very important piece of our, I would say, larger system redesign. 2.1, regarding the Division of Disability Rehabilitation Services in the Indiana Housing and Community Development Authority, coordinating and collaborating on improving Indiana 211 for disability-specific information and referrals to be appropriately shared, and making sure that those efforts are made to ensure accessibility and that individuals can use that across and share those resources across the state. DDRS has worked with IHCDA and their team to really, where there's a commitment here to continue to work and coordinate to ensure that we have the right disability related information and referrals and resources. And I would say DDRS will likely be reaching out to several key organizations and stakeholders as well to really kind of get some additional information, as well as any families that have utilized 211 to continue to understand how we can improve that service or that need for the state as well.
Lieutenant Governor, I wonder if we might consider having somebody from 211 that might come and explain that. I have to admit, I don't know much about 211.
Sure.
Well, that's also under housing. Matt, I don't know if you're prepared to address that or if we want to wait.
Just to make sure the room is aware that a couple of years ago, legislatively, oversight of the 211 program in Indiana was moved under IHCDA's jurisdiction. So that is why we are covered under this recommendation to work with DDRS, since we do that oversight function. We do not directly staff the 211, but we are overseeing that contract for the state. So what we have committed to do is to work with DDRS to make sure that the 211 call center, when individuals are calling in, that they are committed to providing as accessible services as possible for individuals with disabilities, and that they are more and more aware of disability services that are available for people to call in. So what we really want is to continue to increase 211 as being that one-stop shop that anyone in Indiana who's looking for assistance can call. So the goal of this recommendation collaboratively is really to make sure, and that's not to say that they're not doing a good job already, but to make it even stronger, the level of services and knowledge they have to assist persons with disabilities calling in for assistance.
Thank you. And perhaps we could have Julie, the Executive Director of 211, make a presentation next week or next meeting. Yes, go ahead.
Real
Andy.
quickly, too, do you guys maintain any metrics or track outcomes about the type or quantity of calls that you guys are receiving?
I'll have to look to see exactly what all we get. I know we
I
do
think
get
we
some
do.
reports on
Laura's
amounts.
saying we do.
Yeah. I don't know exactly what all those metrics are that we receive, but we do receive constant updates as far as call frequency and responses. Yeah.
They do track the number of calls they receive each day, each month, when they're answered. They track the services that they're connected with, and kind of, a broad pie chart of, where the people who are calling in from, what services they were connected to, whether it's 1 or 10, based on their needs. So I know Julie would be happy to share that at the next task force meeting, so great idea.
Transportation. Transportation strategies are promoting independence and employment through collaborative efforts of key stakeholders and public and private partnerships across rural and urban areas. We know, as I said before, transportation is a key need and a barrier for individuals with disabilities. Christine Dahlberg, Governor's Council for People with Disabilities, I appreciate, as I'll call you maybe a sister agency. I very much appreciate their ability to focus in and collaborate of where there's holes, which maybe the Division of Disability has these funding sources and Department of Education has these funding sources. So I've really appreciated the leadership of the Governor's Council for People with Disabilities to really allocate funding where there are some needs that there's some other agencies that just don't have the opportunities to be as creative with their funding, if I will. So with Christine's work, they've convened an ongoing interagency work group led by Health by Design. So this work group is focused on mobility management in Indiana. The effort started with working together to develop existing systems, what's going on currently, and then looking at what are really the system maps in Indiana. It's included the launch of a 3-part training series on disability and transit funded by the Governor's Council and delivered in partnership with the Indiana Statewide Independent Living Council. While these are encouraging initial developments, definitely additional policy consideration and funding strategies will be needed probably on a state level as well as local community level. Christine, is there any additional comments you would like to make, or no?
How does that interact or fit in with the non-emergency medical transportation Medicaid service?
So I don't know that it would specifically interact, but non-emergency medical transportation, as you know, is a Medicaid state plan service for individuals to get transportation for non-emergency medical needs. And this is something I think I would say it doesn't necessarily, it's probably as part of the mapping process of how if you look, how do individuals that have barriers of transportation and may receive Medicaid, that would be maybe a option for certain services or activities that they need to do. What I think, Christine, your group from the meetings that I have attended are really looking more broadly to making it more, if I could, maybe more universal, that looking at the state and local options.
Yeah, the project that we're working on really has no direct bearing on the Medicaid transportation program. That's part of the mix. There have been some recent changes in it, and so there some discussion at some of those meetings as to what has changed and how are people accessing transportation now, and but it's been just a small part of the overall picture for that particular thing. So that's not something we're really addressing.
All right, 2.5, regarding the maximizing and incorporation of technology in the delivery of services to people with disabilities to increase individuals' access to the community, utilize them as natural supports and assist in addressing one way to address some of the direct support professional workforce shortage. DDRS recently engaged in a group of Indiana assistive technology subject matter experts to provide really some start of insight in developing a strategic approach to technology. In addition, the division is completing our research and best practices on emerging models. In fact, the national directors, the Developmental Disabilities Director Conference was held last week in Seattle, and that whole conference was about technology options for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So that was great timing for some of the recommendations that we have in the 1102. So over the next few months, DDRS will be working with this group, and we will be formalizing a more work group, if you will, a formalized work group with disability advocates, key stakeholders, technology experts, hopefully on an ongoing basis to maximizing technologies throughout actually all programs. We believe that a key critical quick need in the waiver redesign process is how do we expand technology options for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, but then on a bigger scale, how do we utilize technology really in all facets of a person's life that may have some funding opportunities with the work of the programs within the Division of Disability and Rehabilitative Services, but other programs that touch individuals with disabilities as well as the aging population. I think there are some, as we all talked about at the last 1102 meetings, that there's some great opportunities in expansion in technology that could be very helpful. Other just quick related ones, Indianapolis recently hosted the Disability Cocoon Tech Fest. The as I indicated, the Division of Disability and Rehabilitation Services is part of our research. We are also on a statewide consortium of technology of states. Now this is sounding real government, isn't it? But there is a small contingency of about 10 states that have band together to really start talking about what are all other states doing in this field. How is Medicaid kind of expanding their lens of how do you pay for some of these services? So it's been helpful. Again, it helps set the stage for a future work group on technology for Indiana. And lastly, again, as I said, we look at the waiver redesign activities, again, to hopefully utilize services and supports to expand these technology definitions within the waiver to ensure that there's some access to technology services that individuals want.
Could you give a couple of examples of the types of technology that might be most helpful?
Absolutely. So there's a wide range of technology. So with respect to right now, Indiana has what's called electronic monitoring, which doesn't sound awesome, right? Utilizing that Medicaid service, it sounds like you just got out of jail. But really, it's an ability to utilize potentially other devices like cameras and remote supports, if you will, so that if someone has some issues within the home, it doesn't automatically mean a staff person comes to assist, that there's ability to remotely kind of tap into the house to say, hey, are you okay? Or who's at the door? Do you need assistance with X, Y, and Z on your goals? Maybe it's getting ready in the morning or making sure that you have things that you need to cook dinner, those types of things. There are also things regarding smart home technology that can be very beneficial to individuals living independently. Assistive artificial intelligence, everything from as simple as Amazon Alexa, right? That helps. You can program it to help people reminder of to take medications or to help with them if they're getting ready to work to understand what's the weather, what should I be wearing today based on some of their potential individualized needs. And then it's things as simple as phones and smart technology on your phone and apps that can help individuals with daily reminders, with apps of geolocation to assist from that health and safety piece. So let's say we have a young 20-year-old that wants to live independently but has some maybe seizure issues or has autism and there's a history of elopement, maybe an opportunity through geolocation or through the watches or through their phone that allows the support or natural supports like caregivers or mom and dad to know that, oh, John went to work. Oh, look, now he's back here. He's at lunch here and he's returned home, and I don't necessarily need a staff person to go down and confirm that he's safe at home. So there's some opportunities, I think, as we continue to expand the utilization of technology in our own lives. How do we offset some of that technology need to ensure that individuals with disabilities have access to that? To be frank, I think that allows people sometimes a life that's more independent, and to be fair, maybe they're happier than having some person come check on them. Now, that doesn't solve everything, right? But it's one way for an appropriate pairing with technology in an individual based on the individual's needs that I think there's some great creative solutions that were things that we didn't think about 25 years ago or didn't have.
Can you expand just a little bit more on the research and development aspect, and are there any opportunities to partner with our universities in that regard?
No, absolutely. So our key partner that we have, we go directly to. So we have a federally assistive technology grant within the Division of Disability and Rehabilitation. Actually, the AT grant sits under the Bureau of Rehabilitation Services. I'm sorry, there's a lot of words. But that grant goes to Indata, which is through Easter Seals Crossroads. And I think Wade is here, actually, somewhere. Wade. So Wade and his team are gurus in the world of technology. And to be very frank, they have some national and international presence on the work that they've done in technology. They have a lending library. They have low interest rate loans for some needs of technology. They have great training opportunities. So to be fair, we have some great experts within Indiana, and then we have really worked with Ohio most recently as they have some key technology initiatives. They have an executive order regarding technology first state. And we really are looking at them based on their strategic plan. So how are they utilizing that philosophy to really strategically utilize that in their Medicaid programs, right? You can imagine some parents, if you go up and say, hey, remote supports would be great for your son that has 24/7 staffing, may or may not be appropriate, but sometimes families are need more prompting or more education, or they need to see it successful somewhere else. And sometimes also as myself as a family member, you say, well, that works for that person, but that's not going to work for him, right? So it's really educating, demonstrating that this can be successful for the right fit. And so I think we have some infrastructure in Indiana to do that. I think we are trying to be a little thoughtful and strategic and rolling this out so that we get excitement and we get buy-in and we get people, families eager and excited to try some new technology so that we can put that within the Medicaid waiver so that there's some funding opportunities for it.
Senator Melton, I know that one of the remote products, Rust Assured, was actually developed in partnership with Purdue University. So, and along those lines, my recollection was 30,000 people on the waiver, but there were only about 200 folks using the remote monitoring. Is that?
It's unfortunately less than that.
Less than 200.
Yeah.
So what do you think the barriers are to not more use of that?
Well, I'm sure we can all probably chime in with what some of those barriers. I think some of it is barriers of education, of families and utilization. I think it will be less and less of a barrier of a generation of, young adults coming in that may need supports in our system. I think it is, to be fair, funding of some of those electronic opportunities or technology opportunities, whether that's through a Medicaid program or vocational rehabilitation or just other opportunities that they have. That's why I've really appreciated Indata and some of their work outside, that people can even try something out to see if that makes sense for them, a technology piece, and then decide for themselves before they actually purchase it and to say, yes, this really will be helpful. I don't know, and other people have some chime in on barriers or concerns?
Yeah, Passages were actually a provider that utilizes electronic monitoring services, and really getting started, it's education of parents, families, guardians, persons served. And then it's really just a community mindset too.
Yeah.
When like you said, when you make that leap to it, just an understanding of it. And key is to start small too. We started in 2 of our houses about a year ago, and now we're moving to the next phase. And yeah, and they'll tell you whether it's Rest Assured or Night Owl to tell you just to start small and proceed slowly.
Yeah. In some anecdotal and some from Rest Assured and other entities and organizations that do these types of supports, you also they have demonstrated in some cases that behaviors have actually decreased by utilization of remote supports. Sometimes just the maybe personality mix of a caregiver or a paid caregiver and the individual that's receiving services. You can imagine if that doesn't fit, you even know, like a roommate, someone that you actually, chose and live with, that can be frustrating, specifically for an individual with developmental disabilities that may have a barrier in expressive and receptive communication, so I think there's some opportunities to increase their privacy, to increase their independence, but still have the ability to, and that's why I hate the monitoring term, because I think it's unfair to say because you have a disability, we're going to monitor you, but based on the individual's need, you can start small and build up. We also see with companies like Rest Assured and others that they have started with cameras and really kind of intensive remote monitoring, and they've actually stepped it down because they figured they don't really need this much support anymore, and they are really doing a great job living independently, and they put in the supports on an as-needed basis, or if something happens, there's a backup plan of being able to contact someone or being able to tap in remotely to have that assistance. So again, Dr. Council, I think it's a great space for the aging as well as individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So it's an exciting initiative, one that we are, again, thoughtfully kind of putting together a strategic charter for a larger work group. And to be frank, I have very much appreciated Indata and some of our assistive technology gurus, experts in Indiana to really help us frame how this can move forward. 3.2, the creation of services and support system that support and promote self-advocacy, independence, and informed choice, which leads to a good life. This is more of a, I would say, a philosophical need regarding the individuals that we serve. But the division, again, several years ago, we hosted 15 family and self-advocate statewide forums with the ARC of Indiana. As part of that, we invested in becoming part of what's called the Supporting Families Community of Practice, which is adopting the Charting the Life Course framework. Both of these efforts really focus on empowering individuals and their families to design their own life. Not to say, here, if you're going to use services, here's your service life, but really make them and empower them to be in the driver's seat to move forward. I will say I have to brag on the DDRS team and the staff. We received a national award at the Life Course Conference last month at the University of through the University of Kansas City, Missouri, for the work we've done in innovation and person-centered planning for individuals receiving waiver services. So that is very exciting to receive some national recognition from the team to really, while it's not perfect, but really to move in a direction to make sure the individual is in the driver's seat and the families are able to provide the support they need in the person-centered context and values. So again, this will be, again, philosophically, the 3.2 will be a key element in the waiver redesign. We want to make sure that we are putting services and supports through this waiver that individuals and families want. They are the voice of this. They should be driving and telling us what is working and what is not working, so that we are able to really look at better outcomes for the individuals that we serve, and to just be frank, to let them live the life that they choose to live. 3.3, the design and implementation of a self-directed care model in Medicaid HCBS waivers administered by the DDRS for individuals to convert their shift model to a version that allows them to hire people they choose via a fiscal intermediary. So a self-directed care model is, if you will, another vehicle or another option that we can do through home and community-based Medicaid services. I will say that we are looking at that as being part of the exploration of the waiver redesign efforts moving forward. 3.4, looking at adults who participate in Medicaid HCBS waiver services be allowed through informed choice to receive direct services and supports from one or more family members to meet their assessed needs, and that no individual family member be allowed to provide more than 40 hours of support within a 7-day period. Again, this is an area that we hear a lot about, and again, we will be looking at addressing this as part of the waiver redesign as well. Another, again, service option, support option based on the individual's desires with their connection with their own family members to help provide their service and support needs. How are we on time? And these are shorter, okay. 3.5, the establishment of a statewide IDD crisis response program utilizing all available federal funding, and as needed, those required components as outlined there, 1 through 7. We had great legislation through HEA 1488, which requires FSSA to work in partnership with the 1102 Task Force to develop a plan for statewide crisis assistance by July 1st of 2020. And to establish a statewide crisis assistance program by July of 2021. I will say future legislation action likely will be needed to provide the appropriate funding necessary based on the plan that we develop on July of 2020.
How are you moving forward with that, Kylie?
So right now I think we've had a lot of internal and external, informal conversations. I think there are a lot of, I know NARF has had some work that they probably even have done internally. The ARC, Indiana ABC has provided some information. Thank you, Tom. And we are working together, I think, to really devise what this looks like. I think this is probably a great discussion piece, even at the next agenda item on, we got legislation passed, which is great. So what are the next steps? DDRS is happy to take the lead on this, and I would love to hear feedback on what does this task force, kind of what their expectation is. How do we want to maybe move forward since it isn't formalized? We're happy to have some comments and discussion on that.
I think if I might add to that, we've also had some great conversations with our partners at the Division of Mental Health and Addiction around some things they're looking at around crisis. They've done some in-depth research in some other states that have been successful with that. So we are having ongoing conversations with them as well to kind of be strategic and moving forward with this.
So I don't know if Matt's still there or not, but there are several states with 211 systems that those crisis calls go there first and then get directed to wherever the actual response team is. So that's another linkage to keep in mind.
And would the task force be agreeable to have this as an agenda item? Some further discussion on this next meeting? Okay. Thank you, Kyler.
No, thank you. 3.6, encouraging support of our active duty and veteran military members in Indiana in obtaining services for children with IDD and pending CMS approval, creating a priority status on Medicaid HCBS waivers for children of active duty and veteran military families. As you guys, many of you know, we had legislation regarding House Enrolled Act 1296. The Division and the Office of Medicaid Policy and Planning are working on an amendment right now with the Family Support Waiver, which adds the priority category. Public comment and amendment ended on June 7th. So following State Budget Committee review and approval, the amendment will be submitted to CMS for approval. So pretty soon that will be moved into the green.
And have other states done this?
To be fair, I don't know exactly.
Yeah, there are some.
What are the other states?
Yeah, I think Wyoming or Colorado are a couple that have done that. So is the wait list now about 7 months for the family support waiver? So
Julie,
this
you have the most recent data
moves them up in front of those.
It's at about 8.5 months. I think what will happen sort of from a standpoint once the approval is done is that we will send letters to all the individuals who are on the waiting list to determine if they meet that military or veteran status, and then as people come into supports newly, that the staff will look at that, and they will not be placed on the waiting list. They will just go into the priority category and be able to go onto that family supports waiver.
3.7, Division will encourage the use of emerging technology in Medicaid HCBS waiver service delivery. I did just write C recommendation 2.5. Our robust conversation regarding technology directly applies to this 3.7 to really not only encourage and help train and inform individuals of how emerging technologies may be beneficial, but also how do we really make sure that those technologies are appropriately embedded in the Medicaid HCBS waivers that we're looking at redeveloping. 3.8, telehealth to be approved as a viable and approved service delivery method for services, for example, related to behavior management and wellness care. This is, again, an ongoing kind of exploration as part of the waiver redesign as a potential service option. I did indicate that I haven't done a full exploration, but this also may be an area need for legislative action. 3.9, the inclusion of peer specialists as a Medicaid HCBS waiver service, enabling experienced, trained people with IDD to support their fellow Hoosiers with disabilities. Again, as looking at this as a particular Medicaid HCBS service, we will be exploring this recommendation as part of the waiver redesign process. To be fair, the waiver redesign process covers about 1/3 of these recommendations, the 1102 recommendations. It's really looking at how do you redesign that entire system and service delivery. So again, anything related to an HCBS Medicaid service is something that we'll be exploring as part of the waiver redesign process. 3.10, Indiana encourage efforts to increase the use of supported decision-making and other alternatives to guardianship. Well, thanks to many efforts, specifically with Indiana Disability Rights and the ARC of Indiana, SEA 380 provides an option for supported decision making. I would say this is critical and awesome news for the individuals that we support. And it's critical, like technology, that we continue to provide appropriate information and education to families and individuals on guardianship and alternatives to guardianship and supportive decision making. So I can't take credit for this one, but I definitely was there, a cheerleader behind the scenes. I very much appreciate all the efforts to get this passed.
Now, is this completed? Is this a completed item?
I'm sorry?
Is this a completed item?
Yes. I guess to be fair, it is a completed item.
Okay, so
I'll
we
say
can
it's
move
completed.
it.
Yeah, good point. Thank you.
I'd say that there's still more work to do. The law may be passed, but encouraging families to use the law as an alternative to guardianship is the next step. And so one of the things that we're working with Indiana Disability Rights Network, the council is working with them, and to have some train-the-trainer sessions. We've got one coming up at the end of the month that's like a trial one, and then a big one in July where we are inviting as many people as would be interested to come and really learn how to use supported decision-making and assist possibly themselves, their families, but also other families in their community on how to appropriately use it and how it works, and why it really increases the choice and independence of people with disabilities. So that's the next step, and we're working on that too.
So I would probably agree with Christine. We probably need to keep it in yellow, because just because the law has passed doesn't mean that it's moving, and I think there is some continuation of training and needs. So we can, based on some of the work that you guys are doing, we can continue to filter and bolster some of that status on that.
If I can add real quick as well, someone from DDRS, probably me, will be attending the training onto the self-determination. And then also we recently had a all-day family training around the life course framework, and we did a panel and some information on how to use that life course framework for supported decision making. So while we're very excited about the legislation, continue to partner with everyone on moving this forward is one of our priorities.
Thank you. 4.1, regarding the First Steps Early Intervention Program, really looking at investing in its workforce to keep pace with the demand of by increasing the number of service coordinators and providers, and paying service coordinators and providers a rate that is competitive and supports effective recruitment and retention. Really, this action item is also broadening the network of specific services needed in the early intervention system. Again, thanks to the General Assembly and key legislators, this is kind of going up to recommendation 3.1, but I will say as part of that, to ensure that that additional funding is utilized appropriate for the rate increases for service coordination or the single point of entry, as well as the providers. We are in the process really this week of finalizing what does that increase look like with the additional funding we have. There was a breakdown of 50% of the additional funding can be used for provider rates, 40% of the additional funding received can be used for the single point of entries, or where the service coordinators sit, and then 10%, like I said earlier, can be used for infrastructure for the early intervention program. So more to come on that. Yeah.
So for the legislators, and Representative Claire knows this better than I do, we're deeply appreciative of the additional funding, and it was significant. Yeah. But to get to those competitive therapy rates, we were looking at increases that averaged about 55%, because the rates really were 2002 rates. So this is going to significantly help, but it's not going to get us near that average of a 55% increase in the therapy rates and the others also. A great help, very much appreciate it, but I want to make sure you guys understand it gets us part of the way there, but not to the competitive levels.
Sure. Thanks, Steve.
I would like to echo that. I think the General Assembly still has work to be done, and I hope that it's a possibility that the budget might be open next year. That would be up to leadership, but I think if it is, because revenues are coming in right now at a higher rate than anticipated, But either way, in the future, we need to increase those rates for therapies. I mean, it is critical because a lot of these facilities and people with disabilities are really under the gun as far as providing services, and it's really hard to find even people that will provide those services at the rates that are being paid right now.
Absolutely. Are there any states that do pay competitively? Are there any states that do pay competitively?
Yeah, I'm going to say there are, but admittedly there are other states who don't. Arizona is a good example. Like Kylie's aware of this. For example, on their waiver, they update rates every year, and then they say we're going to pay 85% of the rate or 90% of the rate. So they're constantly keeping up with what that rate should be. But there are other states, Virginia, for example, I think Missouri. Those are a couple of states that, in particular with their early intervention programs, do have much more competitive therapy rates for providers. So there are some out there who do.
This is an area that Indiana has fallen behind, not only in this area, but home care rates, all kinds of assisted living rates. I mean, it is the ARC in Evansville is starving to death because they cannot receive additional funding for services, and that we've been trying for a long time to get them because they don't have the workshops and community beds that other providers have, the NRF beds that other providers have, and that they can sort of use part of that funding to offset shortfalls, and they are starving to death.
Yeah, no, great conversation, absolutely. 4.3, the creation of an array of employment options that leads to a good life with independence and respect of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and ensures informed choice. The array of options should provide opportunities for people with disabilities to work and grow, respect preferences in developing the array of those options. A stakeholder group led by Self Advocates of Indiana, Sean over there, must come together to discuss the use of 14C certificates, or commonly referred to as sub-minimum wage, in Indiana and in 2019, and develop strategies to assist provider agencies to transition away from utilizing the 14C certificates. I will turn it over to Sean and or Andy, but I give you a quick glimpse on the status. So the employment work group has convened and is meeting on a regular basis. On a related note, the national dialogue relative to 14C certificate continues. Recently, the Department of Labor's Office of Disability and Employment Policy announced the opening of a national online dialogue about sub-minimum wage. This dialogue is scheduled to continue until June 14th. So you can, go ahead.
I just found out that deadline has now been extended, and I don't know how it was announced, but I actually looked on the website after seeing a new announcement that said June 24th, and I thought, well, that's not right. And I looked in, so we've got a little longer to get engaged in that dialogue. And I did submit some comments, and they're fascinating what people are writing and some of the stories that are being told. It's really interesting, and I think it's a good way to let your. I'm not sure what they're going to do with all that information once they've collected it, but it is. There's quite a variety of different opinions that are being aired. So,
no, thank you for that update and the extension timeline. I think the goal of the online dialogue is to really capture perspectives about Section 14C based on actually individual input from those that are on the ground, and they'll glean that information summarized to provide ODEP an overview of Section 14C at the state and national level. So to be fair, this is a national conversation. This just isn't an Indiana conversation, but Sean or Andy, do you have anything you want to add to the great work you've done already to initiate this group?
Well, I don't know exactly what to say, but I am really honored to be doing this because it's a really good thing that I believe in, to get people the pay and the jobs that they need to get. So I'm hoping that we all can work together and make this great.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Sean, and thanks for your leadership on that as well. Andy?
So Sean's interesting because he always says initially, but he doesn't know what to say, and then always says the exact right thing. So I will add that the group has met once already. We've got our next meeting scheduled for June. We had significant conversation around 14C, but that wasn't the only thing that we talked about. So we did talk about best practices. We talked about benefits and how to get more people with disabilities working out in the community. I'm encouraged by the fact that throughout this whole process and listening to you go through all of these different recommendations, that individuals with disabilities, self-advocates, are actively participating in so much of what we're working on. With this work group, we've taken it a step farther, and self-advocates are actually leading the group. So they're not just at the table, they're calling the shots and facilitating the meeting. So as an observer in the room, I'm excited to see where that goes, and I'm looking forward to the results under Sean's leadership.
Thank you. Any other comments on that one? 4.4, developing a plan to enable the Bureau of Rehabilitation Services to serve all order of selection priority categories by 2021 or as soon as possible, which would rely upon increased fiscal and staffing resources. House Enrolled Act 1488 requires the Bureau of Rehabilitation Services to assess its ability to serve all order of selection categories and report the results of its assessment to the Commission of Rehabilitation Services and the 1102 Task Force. So HEA 1488 also includes a timeline for moving out of order of selection when increased fiscal and staffing resources are available. I will also say, related to this requirement, vocational rehabilitation continues to be in the process of really assessing where we are and looking at recently with some of this legislation and some of our needs of fiscal needs, how we can potentially expand our resources to look at the compensation of our vocational rehab counselors and field staff. And so we are in the very beginning stages of looking at that to, again, part of the reason we were initially went to order of selection was the need for, like all other workforce areas, was the need for the recruitment and retention of VR counselors to serve the population of individuals that utilize vocational rehabilitation. So more to come as part of that 1102 kind of report out as well. For order of selection and vocational rehabilitation.
Representative Claire, that you were the author of that bill. Do you have any comments?
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor Crouch. I appreciate Kylie's comments on it. We worked on that timeline together, a whole bunch of stakeholders, and certainly Kylie and her team were part of that. And I hope we can continue to work together to make sure the resources are in place. Because the timeline, as Kylie suggested, depends on certain resources being available. So we tried to develop a realistic timeline, and obviously the division will have to have resources in order to stay on that timeline. Is that fair?
That's fair. Yeah, appreciate that.
Lieutenant Governor, I think this fits into one of your earlier questions. $3 million in state funds leaves $11 million of federal funds on the table. So, and Kylie and her team put together a great plan, very detailed, terrific timelines, and it wasn't even that much money. So it wasn't a full $3 million. I believe it was $0.8 million year one, $1.8 million year two, to implement the plan of getting out of order of selection, but it wasn't able to be funded by the legislature. So This is a 80%, nearly 80% federal match program, so it's a good example of leaving money on the table.
So the majority of our states in this country, I think, are under some sort of order of selection process or structure. Can you comment or provide any information about states who have come out of that or how they're progressing toward similar goals?
Sure. So there are we were at the Developmental Disabilities National Conference, and so they do not oversee the vocational rehabilitation program, but there's clearly a close kind of partnership, if you will, between those national associations of directors. I learned recently at that particular conference that actually 9 other states closed all categories for order of selection. So I think it is a time for vocational rehabilitation, if you will, that with some of the, and I'll be very fair to say that the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, the federal law that is governing vocational rehabilitation, and some of their mandates are great, and they're proactive, and they are very much focused on students and being able to ensure that those students get off on the right footing for employment. But it also did require vocational rehabilitation programs in all states to shift 15% of their operation budget to serving students, which is, again, positive. But at the same time, it didn't maybe account for some of the like operational needs of kind of maintaining a number of referrals and meeting the federal timelines in order to make sure that you can move forward. So to be fair, I think some of that shift, I haven't talked to every state, but some of that shift is really that pain of shifting that operational budget to only be used for students, because if it's not used for students in that pre-employment transition services, that money cannot be used anywhere else. It's earmarked only for that. And so you can imagine 15%, depending on the budget of the state. In our state, it's roughly about $10 million that can be shifted and utilized for pre-employment transition services, but can no longer be utilized for the sustainability of just our general operations of seeing individuals that come in for vocational rehabilitation. Again, in a philosophical point, I have no disagreement with really investing in the students proactively, but it does has an impact on making sure that the vocational rehabilitation operational and administration, it's just a change. So I think many of the states are going through that shift. I think it is a great opportunity with some of the Employment First initiatives, with some of the work to include, that we continue to push the access points for individuals with disabilities into other workforce programs, from educational, from career and technical, as I talked about a little bit, from post-secondary educational opportunities, and again, other workforce, youth, and adult programs. It's a shame when we're talking in 2019 about inclusion that we say because you have a disability, your workforce option is vocational rehabilitation. Now, I'm saying this is a myth, a folklore, right? But really, an individual with a disability has a disability and has a barrier. To be fair, we all have some type of barrier in workforce that we need help with. In fact, Laura and Tom were super helpful with one of my barriers this morning. But how do we really help educating families and individuals that while vocational rehabilitation is absolutely a service that has some unique services to assist individuals with various types of disabilities overcome their barrier to get employment, I think it's also time to recognize that we should not isolate individuals with disabilities by just allowing them to say this is the only workforce program for you. I was talking to a parent at a recent meeting, and they were talking about having their school transition meeting with their child that was in special education, had an individualized education program, and she said, vocational rehabilitation was not at my meeting. That's the transition service that should have been there. And while I would love for all of my, I love them dearly, vocational rehabilitation counselors to attend every 53,000 transition IEP conferences, I have 170 vocational rehab counselors, right? So that's even not that's impossible for that transition age youth. But what I want people to do is start expanding to talking to their individual to student to utilize pre-employment transition services to start exploring what is it that this child student wants to do when they graduate. What is it that they're interested in? Let them go get internships or summer jobs or work experiences to know kind of and give them a path. And then after that, then determine what is the service for vocational training or post-secondary or vocational rehabilitation or through a program at Department of Workforce Development that they need access to. And really make sure that accommodations are also provided appropriately in those federal and state programs so that people can ensure continued access. This is not to downplay the need for vocational rehabilitation to continue to evaluate and ensure that we can serve as many people that we fiscally and staffing resource-wise can serve. But I think in the time of today and Employment First, it's critical that we expand our ability in workforce to ensure individuals with disabilities have access. And they aren't thinking that because I'm on a wait list for vocational rehabilitation, that means I have to just sit and wait until my spot opens up. That we should really encourage and provide other resources for that individual to also identify a pathway to employment.
Are there any examples across the state of communities that's doing it well in terms of outreach and communication to businesses, encouraging them to look at this population as employees? I'll be curious to know if how can that be replicated, and also out of the budget that you all operate with, how much is allocated towards marketing or communication?
So very fair question. I appreciate that question. So I think there are some, if I can, first question with regarding communities who are doing it well, I think and please join in as a task force, I think there are some great community opportunities, and there's some great employers that have really stepped up to say, we want to do this, not because this is like a disability, a nice touchy-feely thing to do, but we really want to invest in this untapped workforce that we know have skills and that we know can be truly dedicated and high performers in the job market, in the jobs that we are seeking. So individuals and communities that come to mind are Fort Wayne and some of their work that they've done in collaboration with their local workforce development board and some of our providers that receive funding in their pre-employment transition services. I would say an INARC provider and the ARC provider, ARC of Gibson County, and actually I'll say my Bureau of Rehabilitation Community and Development team have worked hand in hand to do some great work with Toyota in Princeton, Indiana. I will also point out Andy Kirby and their work with the Erskine Green Training Institute and really providing a very evidence-based approach to employment and gaining skills for individuals with disabilities that they have great success with, of not only getting them trained in the area that they want and desire, but really having some success of finding a job. Also say IU Health has also in partnership not only with Erskine Green, but some of the other entities in the state. And I'll brag a little bit on the state of Indiana. I think we have some great work with hiring. I know within FSSA, but likely other entities in the state. I think we can always do better, but I think there's some opportunities for internships. Project search sites throughout the state are also another great avenue that we are getting those key partnerships with schools, the local communities, and the business really involved in giving those students those experiences. And sometimes there's some great actual jobs that come from that as well. Any other? Yes, absolutely.
Oh, that's extremely helpful. I would also look at businesses that have a very intentional effort on inclusion and diversity, because this, of course, falls under that umbrella. But going back to what you mentioned about the state, possibly looking at whom within the population are entrepreneurs, and could they provide, could they be a vendor to the state in any capacity? That might be some low-hanging fruit to, for the state to better partner with with the population that we're talking about.
No, I think that's very fair. And in fact, I've talked to several businesses, and that's what I have appreciated most. Many of them coming with an HR director, or just saying we are really focused on kind of this diversity and inclusion priority, not just saying it's a disability even specific initiative. It's just for their culture of their business, this is where they're targeting, and I've appreciated them kind of being more strategic in how they approach this and making sure that they have everything from some of their own culture and diversity training. Some of these businesses have reached out to our particular business and community engagement and others to really just ask for some training. You know, what is this disability etiquette? I kind of joke with people. It's like, well, how do you say hi to someone with a disability? And I say, you say hi, you know. But it's really, sometimes there is just that fear, making sure that they're going to make a misstep, or they're going to violate some type of law, or they're not going to ask the right questions. And it's an ability to really put employers at ease that there is, again, a great network of individuals who want to work. And with some of the supports we're talking about here related to transportation and housing and some services through Medicaid HCBS, I think we can continue to have upward mobility to make sure they can work and also maintain that job through those supports. But I think it's a great one in which we can continue to have some ongoing discussion with 1102, and I'm all ears for any ideas and even business connections to help tell the story.
And you know, there's a program, Ability Indiana, cities that actually promote employment opportunities for individuals with disabilities. There are 3 that are designated to my knowledge. It's Indianapolis, Fort Wayne, and Evansville. And so it might be interesting to have that board or someone associated with that come and talk to us about it, because if we could, then that may be something we could encourage and partner with AIC, that they should, you know, encourage education of that program and have their mayors across the state promote and be a part of that also.
Just real quickly, I think across the state we're getting much better at directly connecting individuals with disabilities to businesses who are looking to hire. So I think, Kylie, you did a fantastic job in answering the question about what's happening at the local community level. That being said, there's still quite a bit of work to be done, and I think that without the assistance that some of these providers and some of these individuals looking for work get from vocational rehabilitation, there will still be barriers and cracks in the road that they have a hard time navigating. So I think that these conversations are critically important. I'm just circling back to my initial question, how many states have gotten off of the order of selection process? I don't think any have, right?
You know, I do believe, so when we were looking at entering order of selection, and if my research, my memory actually serves me, to be fair, I do believe the one that I can think of, it took maybe, I don't know, there's a rough estimate maybe of a range of 5 to 10 years, depending on that. Now, to be fair, states can define how many categories they have under order of selection, and Indiana has 3. Other states have 4, 2, right? So it's a hard one-to-one comparison. But I do, in general, vocational rehabilitation programs nationally are struggling with order of selection right now, and the need. It was a topic nationally at the DD level. Again, I think as far as intellectual and developmental disabilities, and vocational rehabilitation, there's another key kind of momentum that is now that order of selection is open category are those with the most significant disabilities right now. So if there's those partnerships, again, if there's individuals in sheltered work who are saying, I don't want to be in sheltered work anymore, or being sub-minimum wage kind of employment, I want to look at vocational rehabilitation as an option to help me boost and go get a job somewhere else. I think there is some opportunity for this task force in particular and the people we're targeting, that there may be some continued opportunities for those, again, with the most significant disabilities, because that is the open category that vocational rehabilitation is serving in Indiana. Now, I hate painting this broad generalization brush of categorizing people, but that is federally how it is. And there's some opportunities for continued partnership, I think, between vocational rehabilitation and the Bureau of Developmental Disabilities to make sure that those who are seeking employment and want to work, that those individuals have the appropriate opportunity to gain access to the vocational rehabilitation system.
And this is going to be very complicated. It's a big job, and as a formal recommendation, it's going to be tough to work through. So I think the group certainly has the understanding and needs to understand that we've got a plan. There's a strategy in place to get through this. I'm not sure if other states have implemented similar plans, but the fact that not many of them have gotten off of order of selection speaks to how difficult it is to get this done. So the fact that it's a formal recommendation is a good thing, but the work that needs to be done to get off of that or to get back to where we need to be is going to be difficult.
Sure. But one that we definitely are striving to make progress. Yeah.
Kylie, I want to speak to opportunities for employment for people with disabilities. This is a real sensitive topic with me because I work with a lot of contracts, doing a lot of RCPs, and a lot of businesses do business with Indiana, and I think there is a provision for asking how much of your business will be provided to women and minorities. I think we should include persons with disabilities as well. What's your track record for a balanced workforce if you want to do business with Indiana? I think that's a fair trade.
Sure. Some good thoughts for sure. I think it goes back to your diversity and inclusion piece as well. Yeah.
How many folks are currently being deferred? The number 2,500 sticks in my mind.
Yes, I would need to confirm, but I was thinking 2022, but it may be 2,500.
And my recollection was it's a. I'll say this as best I can.
Yeah.
It's a significant but a small percent of the folks with intellectual disabilities, like I think it's 6 or 7%. A lot of folks with hearing impairments, a lot of folks with mental health issues. Is that kind of still the
I'd have
pattern?
to look, to be fair, to look at the breakdown, but that as far as looking at it overall, that is who we're seeing as deferred. And I'll also be clear that out of roughly, let's say, 2,500 individuals that are deferred, that doesn't mean that all 2,500 of them do not have jobs. Vocational rehabilitation helps individuals also maintain their employment, so they may have employment, but unfortunately, due to our order of selection, they're unable to access vocational rehabilitation to pay for likely some critical service need or device or technology that they may need replaced to ensure that they can maintain their job. So to be fair, yes, there's individuals that have hearing impairments that are deferred, individuals with mental illness. As far as categories go, that's what we're seeing as the trend currently. So now I think we're going down into the red, need action. So recommendation 1.2 regarding an appropriation to be known as the 1102 IDD Task Force Community Living Expansion Initiative, which is looking to fund Medicaid HCBS waiver slots for non-emergency priority placements using criteria developed by the Division of Disability and Rehab Services to allow some level of expansion of individuals seeking to live in a community away from their family, while creating the opportunities for families to support individuals making this transition and living away from their family. Again, looking at this, I think it's an area that we will continue to have bigger conversations with respect to, if you will, a waiver redesign, but legislative action would be necessary to make this specific change. 1.5, increased funding for vocational rehabilitation services to ensure the program can address the fiscal deficit, increase vocational rehabilitation staffing resources, and ensure appropriate reimbursement rates for providers to cover the costs for recruit and retain staff. Again, looking at, I think, of no There was great effort of this in Indiana this session. Unfortunately, this is an area that would need continued legislative attention and need. 2.6, in collaboration with stakeholders, Indiana shall explore, expand, and promote workforce initiatives to help employers in hiring disabilities to create an inclusive workforce, which may include an access to tax incentives, recruitment and retention strategies, and training resources. I indicated here that tax incentives would require some type of legislative action. I will point out Indiana Manufacturers Association partners with the ARC of Indiana to really start strategizing this area as well. 4.2, the creation of an array of living settings that support people with disabilities living in a setting of their informed choice that allows them to enjoy their interests, hobbies, and preferred life. We do have looked kind of related to some of the needs a work group has convened in this area, but further action is much needed. 4.5, increasing as soon as possible the current statewide average wage of direct support professionals to a level competitive with other sector and healthcare jobs. I will say again, not without some great efforts legislatively this year. We will need continued legislative effort in that regard. 4.6, the development of a state-approved outcome and competence-based training and curriculum for direct support professionals. Really looking at the purpose of this training to ensure that consistency and quality across our provider network who assist with individuals on the home and community-based settings waivers. Again, this is an area of really looking at kind of a legislative and policy need still. 4.7, the implementation of a public registry listing direct care staff who the Division of Disability and Rehabilitative Services has determined have committed certain offenses that bar them from employment supporting people with developmental and disabilities in the state of Indiana. Again, I think there's been some internal and external conversation. I know I personally have talked to some, done some research based on this, but to be fair, this continues to need some legislative action regarding that. And 4.8, appropriations for DDRS and other state agencies sufficient to develop, plan, and implement the task force recommendations. It's always weird to talk about your own bureau and money, but continued discussion and need will be looked at with respect to the current budget with DDRS. So I think that, yes, Representative Claire?
Thank you. You mentioned earlier, Kylie, I think you said before you got to the need action section that about a third of the recommendations go back to waiver redesign. And I think it's at least a third because you've mentioned waiver redesign quite a bit, and you talked about that a little bit at the beginning of your presentation. But now that we've heard all of the status of all of the recommendations, can you go back and talk in more detail about the waiver redesign process, both in terms of timing and how this task force will be involved in that? You talked about the DDRS Advisory Council, is that what it's called?
Yep.
Being the key stakeholder group. But if you can talk about timing and how that relates to the task force and what your expectations are as far as involvement from the task force, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I indicated that the waiver redesign efforts were kicked off in April of 2019. We are in the research stage. So the contractor has taken things that we looked at our data. We have collected kind of key pieces of information from key stakeholders, everything from things that we've tried to do in the past and something fell apart to, I know, some crisis. The START program piece has been submitted to them to review. Things that we know from our family forums, just that our notes from those family forums that they can synthesize and identify, like what are people asking for, what are people frustrated with, and really trying to take the time in several months here to synthesize that information. And so based on all of that, we'll be then going into kind of findings and outlining what would be an appropriate approach for waiver redesign. What does this new redesign look like? What, based on all this information that they have gleaned, that we as part of the division, as well as the council, Division of Disability Rehabilitative Advisory Council, will really kind of work to maybe help provide some direction, or if they have questions, we help answer them. And then at the end of probably winter of 2019, we'll be looking at having an initial concept paper to say, hey, everyone, this is kind of what we're looking at. They'll have the opportunity of kind of public comment, stakeholder feedback. I think that we need to align with some of the upcoming meetings of making sure that how do we present this concept paper to the 1102 task force. And then getting all that feedback, we'll then have developing a final concept paper. We're looking again at probably the spring of 2020 for that final concept paper. With that will be kind of some key kind of waiver development piece on top of the waiver rate methodology development piece, right? So when we really identify, here's the direction we're going, then we're going to have to work with our contractor for rate methodology to really develop appropriate methodology and rate structure for any type of new services that we have on those waivers. Again, after that final concept paper, there'll be key stakeholder feedback and opportunities for public comment, and we hope to submit, I say hope, because I also don't want to put a line in the sand and say this has to be it. I want to make sure that we do this methodically and thoughtfully, but we're looking at spring, summer of 2021 to submit a final waiver to CMS to start with their approval process. And I did suggest that maybe at the upcoming meeting that we could have our federal or our national contractor come in and provide a more thoughtful kind of 1102 update on waiver redesign so that you guys feel your questions are answered, you have some additional information, because as you said, waiver redesign is key to many of these recommendations in the direction that Indiana will be going with respect to the Medicaid system.
Thank you. Once you submit to CMS, what's the expected turnaround time there, and when would you expect the new waiver to be approved and implemented?
You know, we are leaving probably roughly a six to 9 month span of time for CMS to review. With our good partners at OMPP, we don't intend to surprise CMS at spring of 2021. We really, as part of the work plan, will be working with the CMS partners and Medicaid partners to kind of keep them in the loop so they are aware of kind of what are we doing. If we have key questions that we need kind of guidance or technical assistance from them, that we're asking them at that time and not waiting to the last minute so that it doesn't continue to extend any type of that review period. So it's about, we're hoping, a 6 to 9 month review process, and as many of you may know with CMS, it's hard to really pinpoint an exact time frame, but I do feel like open dialogue and communication in partnership with them along the way will help make it smooth. Yes.
Kylie, on these need action in the red, several of those say need legislative action. In fact, there's 2 on the waiver redesign. Is that something that needs to be approved by the legislature before you do it, or is it just the ongoing process of the waiver redesign?
I
like
think
that 1.2 and 4.2.
Yeah, I think these are related. It's hard to be very frank. It's hard to specifically say what that action should be. I think that's part of this next agenda item, and I don't want to be the one to put forth what specific action needs to happen, because I think collectively as a task force that's part of this discussion. However, some of this may be related to if we choose to do 1.2 and what does that design look like. There may be a need to evaluate our current funding and revenue needs of those programs, and if there are any additional type of fiscal needs. I think that is an area that is part of that fiscal discussion or legislative discussion as well. But because we haven't had the time to really dissect into and say this is how we want to really meet 1.2, it's loose, so I can't tell you here's what an anticipated impact may be, or here's maybe a state law that we need to look at changing because it is preventing us from doing what that design that we want to do.
But to follow up, Senator Becker, I do believe that is perhaps something we need to, as a task force, strategize and kind of determine, with DERS. So perhaps that should be an ongoing agenda item. Yes.
So, Kylie, if the waiver redesign generates the need for additional funding, would that be addressed in the 2021 legislative session? And does that line up with your overall timing?
Yeah, so those are parts and pieces of our timeline that we are trying to figure out still, and really finite and fine tune it. As you know, as sometimes contracts in the state, it was a little bit delayed getting started, so we've had to push our time back further out. But yes, we are keenly aware of what are the needs when we really design this, and then internally, and then what are the needs potentially externally with legislative actions that need to take place.
Any additional questions? Yes, Christine.
In looking at the ones that say need legislative action, almost all of them have to do with more money. I mean, there are other things, some of them are quite lengthy, so there may be other ways we can actually get the same thing accomplished, but each one of them either mentions some kind of tax policy or additional funding that has to be allocated, and so we might want to take a look at that too in regard to, when this plan was put together, it was a consensus document, and so a lot of these recommendations are kind of similar to each other in various ways, and I don't know what we can, but it might be useful to look at everything related to a waiver, kind of segregate out some of the major topic areas as another way to look at what we've accomplished, which I'm very impressed by how many of these are on their way to being accomplished. I think that's pretty remarkable.
Well, and one of the things that's been a benefit to us now is we have legislators on this task force, and for instance, for the tax credit initiatives, perhaps we can have someone from a state that has already enacted that come in and make a presentation so that we all have the same information, but that our legislators who are really committed to this and to advancing, individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, we can start working with them on a plan to get more funding in the future. Representative Clear.
Thank you. Recognizing that much of this does come back to money, obviously there will have to be legislative action, but one of the challenges we had going into the last budget session was that the governor's proposed budget didn't identify some of the funding needs. So I hope that as these discussions go on, there will be an ongoing partnership between the legislature and the administration to make sure that the key funding needs are part of the governor's proposed budget for 2021. Many of us were elated by the increase in funding for First Steps, for example, but we were disappointed that we didn't get the DSP funding, as Senator Becker mentioned earlier. So I think we have to work together to make sure that these priorities are elevated. So I hope, Kylie, that you will engage Secretary Walthall in that and rely on members of the task force to help advocate for that. And I know Lieutenant Governor Crouch will continue to be a champion.
Yeah, I think reiterating that, and just in general, I mean, there's a lot of recommendations here, and many of them fall under the DDRS purview, but I would say they fall under even sometimes partially or not even fully. So having that partnership from all of the stakeholders and key people at key positions that can assist in getting this done is critical. So, duly noted that partnership and collaboration on that is critical. in prioritizing, right, and making sure that we have some strategy with what the timelines are, where we are with respect to various recommendations. And obviously we can't, in the next biennium, say here's all we need for all of these, but being strategic in how and what that means. And I think there's continued ways to kind of continue to partner with potentially other agencies, other divisions, to also help braid some funding opportunities potentially as well.
So I appreciate those comments. That's one of the things that I wrote down initially, Laura, when you were talking about the priorities of the group. It was when legislation or when legislative attention is needed, how is that organized and structured? So I think that's a really good point. I'm glad that that's echoed. As I look through the table, the last column is legislative needs, and those are all empty right now. So I know that there are things that need to happen, and it's going to take a group effort to get those pushed through.
That was your note column. Yeah.
Any additional questions, comments? Thank you, Kylie. Very thorough presentation. Thank you. So our next item on the agenda is discussion of further implementation of the 1102 final task force recommendations, review of legislative action needed. I think we feel like we've almost kind of started that conversation. As we were making notes, we came up with a number of items that we may want to include on our next agenda. The housing, a report from the housing agency by then. The RFP will have gone out, Matt, and they will be able to give us an update on the 2 housing projects that they're in the process of developing. Indiana 211, getting the executive director to kind of give a presentation, have a dialogue with us on what we want to do moving forward. Ability Indiana, that program, is there any benefit in having them come and maybe educate us a little on what they're doing? I know, Steve, you all are very involved with that. Would there be any benefit to that?
I think so. Now, I should disclose, I think some of you know that I'm also the president of the Ability Indiana entity, but I'm glad to have staff come and educate you about the state agencies that are currently buying products and services through Ability Indiana.
Okay. The task force and waiver design, perhaps we can have a conversation and prioritize some of those. Yes, Representative Clear.
Thank you. I really appreciate the report that was presented, despite the small type. This is very valuable. I know Kylie said she was going to send this out electronically to everyone on the task force. I hope this can also be made available publicly. And I think this is a good format for future meetings. I don't know that we'll need to go through it in as much detail, but certainly I think going through recommendation by recommendation and noting any updates or progress or excuse me, action items that are needed would be very valuable for the task force.
Is it a reasonable goal to expect by the end of 2025, when this task force terminates, that all the items shall be under complete, or is that an unrealistic expectation?
I don't think it's unrealistic at all. I mean, that's why we created the task force, and again, I think that's why this is such a valuable tool, because it keeps everybody honest and gives us the ability to monitor and measure progress and discuss how we can all get involved to help move things along, and that's everybody in this room. Members of the task force, including legislators, obviously, the administration, all other stakeholders. But yeah, I think that should be our bold objective, right, Lieutenant Governor Crouch, to check everything off the list and say that the task force was a success.
Mm-hmm. And so with that in mind, does it make sense, or Kylie, is it possible to have like targeted years on these different action items on, when it might be realistic to expect it to move to the completion column? I mean, that'll always continually be evolving, but is that realistic to do?
Yeah, I think we can definitely put some targets. There are some targets clearly in the recommendations, but we can be more as we've started kind of this April specifically related to waiver redesign, the spring kickoff of that. I think we have a better understanding now. Not that it's concrete that it won't change, but I think we have a better understanding of some targeted dates that we can absolutely add in. And where I just don't know, I'll just say I don't know, and maybe that's a kind of a task force discussion of what makes the most sense. I would say from a DDRS perspective, there's a lot of resources being utilized, right? We still have daily operations to do on top of allocating our same staff to do kind of the innovation piece within. So if you can imagine, you're bifurcating a large program implementation and operation, but also then trying to do innovation on top of that. So really figuring out, again, prioritization. And I'm pretty honest to say what I think we can do and what we can accomplish. But I also want to hear feedback from the 1102 task force. If you feel like we've gone down a whole wrong path with what we are kind of, I feel like cumulatively have agreed our priorities, then we can continue to have discussions on those targeted dates.
I appreciate your comment about putting a target date on everything, because I feel a real sense of urgency, and I know that you do, and probably everyone else in this room does. When we look at the calendar and we think about the earlier discussion about the 2021 legislative session and the budget, it's difficult to think about maybe, but we're, what is this, June 13th, so we're less than a month from the budget that we just passed taking effect. But by this time next year, there'll be discussions going on about the 2021 budget, and that budget, if my math is correct, that'll take effect in July of 21 and carry us through June of 23. So you mentioned 5 years earlier. Anything that is going to have a target date in the next 5 years is going to probably have to be accounted for in some fashion, right, Kylie? Going into the 2021 budget session, I see several of my legislative colleagues nodding. So I think next year will be absolutely critical.
And does it make sense, I don't know, to have like working committees if we get into any of these particular recommendations as we're moving through the process, that maybe we need to have a little more targeted group kind of devising and having more meetings and discussions? We can always, at the will of the task force, create some working groups and some committees as we move along to address some of the maybe bigger budget items. That's what I'm kind of thinking of. Are there any other agenda items that we need to include for the next meeting? And certainly if you think of any after this meeting, you can always communicate with Laura, and she is happy to, add those too. But Christine, did you have some thoughts?
I just had a quick thought. It might be interesting to hear from other members of the task force in regard, especially the ones that are part of state government, in regard to, what their agency might be able to assist with in carrying out some of these recommendations. Because as we heard from housing, that was excellent. I really think that I guess what I'd like to see is a broader distribution of work that's being done on this plan beyond solely DDRS. And I think we are seeing some of that, but I'm wondering if there might not be more. Mental health, Department of Education. I'm trying to think of other entities that would have a stake in this.
Yes.
I would include workforce development and IEDC in that. I really appreciated Kylie's comments earlier about the need to make sure that people with disabilities have access to all employment services. And I know that we've had some discussions. You've been involved, Lieutenant Governor, in discussions with IEDC and the ARC about how IEDC views employment of people with disabilities when considering tax incentives. So I think workforce development, IEDC, would certainly be an appropriate part of our discussion.
I think that's a great suggestion. Steve?
You had mentioned earlier a list of the federal dollars. I think that would like to see that on the agenda next time too. Since a lot of this does involve dollars, I think looking at any dollars reverted in the areas that serve people with developmental disabilities would also be important for us to see that.
Yeah, I wonder, Kylie, can we get like the past 3 years of, of monies from any programs that serve that population, if any of those reverted back at the year end?
Yeah, I'm happy to work with our CFO and work on getting that information.
Yeah, I think that's great.
I had one, sorry.
Just to piggyback off that, if we can kind of indicate what requirement of a match is required from the state as we list the federal dollars, that'd be helpful just to know.
No, thank you. Not to change the subject, but to go back to Christine's point, obviously as part of the agenda and the 1102 kind of rules and related to the purpose of today, I will say I would really appreciate that if all of the entities, from NARF to the ARC to IDOE to DMHA to Christine's point, to almost go when you get this document electronically, to go in and add to these recommendations, because I'm sure I'm missing some things. I definitely have some blind spots, but I in no part am going to say that this is DDRS only initiative. And so I think there are some great work being done that maybe from a perspective we haven't even looked at and say, oh wow, what I'm doing here at Department of Education absolutely relates to 1.6, and having the ability to add into that, because I think that will be it will allow the continuous being momentum in really demonstrating all the great work that we are doing and making sure that we don't continue to silo all disability services in the Division of Disability. It allows that expansion to what others are doing that absolutely relate to these recommendations. So I guess to go back to my point, I would love it for you guys when I send this electronically or Laura sends electronically that you guys add to this so that we can continue to review the status of that and maybe consider how we update the report and do the status updates at our next 1102 meetings.
And so to follow up on your conversation, Representative Clearon, including DWD specifically in IDC, so if we would have an agenda item about tax credits and we bring in perhaps someone from a state that has done it, have IDDC be part of that discussion so that they understand, the importance of this. Same with DWD as we do the employment presentation, to have them be a part of it. Or are you thinking having them, invite them to sit in on our task force meetings also?
Some combination. I think there's an opportunity for some education, and you mentioned bringing in somebody from another state that could educate all of us, including IEDC and workforce development. But there's also an opportunity for those two agencies, I think, to report to the task force where things stand today. And, part of our conversation, our ongoing conversation, again, you've been involved in this, is how so many employers simply don't realize the opportunities that are available when it comes to employing people with disabilities, and how we have the opportunity as a state to do a better job of supporting employers and educating employers to make sure they understand what opportunities are available. Particularly, it's a shame right now when we have so many workforce challenges that there are folks who could be part of the workforce or could be playing a different role in the workforce, and they either aren't in the workforce at all, or they're not participating at their full potential. So I think that's the conversation. I don't know exactly what that looks like. We can work with Laura and lots of folks in this room, the other legislators, to figure out what that would look like. And then I think your idea about a subcommittee or something like that might dovetail with that. There may be an opportunity after that presentation or those presentations to turn that into a work group that could come back with some concrete recommendations in early 2020. What do you think?
I think that makes perfect sense. I'll tell you also, can we do any kind of accounting of which state agencies house individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities? I mean, we're talking about government. I mean, how can we be supporting and promoting, some kind of a initiative if we ourselves aren't embracing it? So I wonder who we would go to. I guess personnel or IDOA, or how about if we have Laura work on that? I think that would be interesting to know. I know I'd be interested in knowing that. Yes, Karen.
When we were talking earlier about funding and really understanding where we are and what the needs are moving forward, one thing that came up earlier that I want to make sure we capture in that analysis moving forward, and that's any federal money that's sitting on the table today that we're not taking advantage of. I think we heard an example of leaving an 80% federal match on the table to the tune of many millions of dollars. That example, but certainly any others, so that we can understand that and figure out how best to capture that money.
Agreed. Great suggestion. Steve?
I'd be interested. Sean, his work group on employment, we spent considerable time talking about the benefit cliff. I don't know much about the benefit cliff, but consumers with intellectual disabilities were saying, I'm afraid to take a job in the community, or I'm told I can only work 10 hours or I'll lose my Medicaid. And that's a real barrier. So I'm going to say maybe somebody from Medicaid could come and talk to us about how you can work with them, because they really want to work in the community, but they don't want to lose their benefits. And so this was also a discussion we had with Representative Houston during the session. So I'd be very interested, because I think it fits in with the employment picture.
I was just going to say that I know that OMPP is working on issues like that, such as allowing the HIP power contributions to be utilized a year after a person is no longer eligible for HIP. They're currently working, I believe, on a waiver with CMS, or submitting a waiver to CMS, and I don't pretend to know all the details, but that is something certainly we could discuss with them and include in future presentations.
Yes, Christine.
I think a lot of those fears of self-advocates and families are actually myths. Medicaid buy-in exists in Indiana, which means that you can make a substantial amount of money and pay premiums out of your salary to buy into Medicaid, because many people need the kinds of services Medicaid provides that are not provided by traditional insurance. And so that's why the Medicaid buy-in program exists. Not every state has one. I know IIDC in Bloomington has and trains benefit counselors to work with people who are looking to get a job, or with organizations, so that they are better able to inform and educate people as they're considering employment options. So that might be a good place to get someone to come and talk a little bit about about the benefits that really do exist and how people can use them. But I think the need might be more to educate and inform and get rid of some of the old thinking, that, oh yeah, I've always been told I can only work 10 hours a week or I'll lose my benefits. That is just really not true. You do have to be careful. You have to be strategic and make sure you fill out the paperwork and whatever, but you don't have to lose your Medicaid.
Well, I think the conclusion that we came to at the employment work group meeting was the fact, and it was actually proposed by one of our employers who sits on that work group. He asked our self-advocates who were in the room if they had access to a job where they were making a significant amount of money hourly and they were working 40 hours a week with benefits, if they would even want to maintain their benefits. And I think unanimously the answer was no. They would rather not have benefits at all. So I think it's a mindset, and rather than talking to them about how closely they can get to that limit before they lose their benefits, instead it's going through them and letting them know, how much what you can do to, as far as work, and get past that barrier so that they don't have to worry about benefits anymore. And I think when asked that way, it was clear that at least for those individuals who were in the room, they would rather not have to worry about benefits at all.
Up just on that particular issue, are they aware of what benefits they might lose?
I think there is a bit of an educational component to that. I think there is information that they're not getting or that they don't necessarily understand. I think that many of them do, but I think the way that it's presented too many times is you've got to be careful because these benefits we want to protect, and so you can work up until this point. That's been ingrained in them for so many years, and that's what they're used to hearing. So rather than having the conversation about you might not need those benefits with the right opportunity, it's let's get as close as we can without losing them.
I guess I would just be cautious to make sure that they understand completely, healthcare-wise in particular, what those benefits that they could lose would be. I guess.
Sure.
Yes.
I was just going to say I'm glad we wrote the legislation to allow for more than 2 meetings if necessary. So it sounds like we have a lot to cover.
We may not have all these agenda items on the next meeting, but Laura will continue to take input from you all if you have suggestions on additional items that you'd like to have discussed at our next meeting. Is there any additional comments or any further business to come before the task force? Kylie.
As I indicated, I'll send the DDRS advisory members of that, and I also just want to, in general, just let everyone know that's clearly a public meeting, so attendance to that meeting is always welcome. I think that's where, many of the individuals in this room get those type of updates. That I just want to invite, if you have the ability to be there, please come. That's where a lot of the updates regarding the waiver redesign will be, and some of the key elements related to a lot of the 1102 recommendations. So please attend, and I will also send information, and I will make a note to myself. Actually, Laura, you are on those. So Laura is also aware, so she can continue to distribute necessary information to the task force members.
And let the task force members know when the meetings are. Okay. Great. Any additional business? Yes.
And just bring up the recommendation 4.6. I don't know if you talked about that when I had to step out. But around, and just learn more what's needed there. It says needs legislative action. But the Division of Aging is looking at developing some curriculum or training programs for direct care workers, especially around dementia, possibly. And so I was interested in what's needed to move this along around competency-based curriculum for direct support professionals and a statewide registry.
To be fair, the registry one would potentially need some finessing with respect to some Indiana code. The one with respect to outcome and competence-based training is more aligned to funding needs.
Anything else? Great. Well, thank you all so much again for your dedication, commitment to improving the lives of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And our next task force meeting is September 24th at 9 o'clock, and the location will be determined and conveyed to you prior to that. And if you have any additional thoughts, please get to Laura, and we will include them in future discussions. Thank you. We stand adjourned. You don't get a gavel.